Hi, I'm Spencer Campbell of Gila RPGs, and this is another how to play video for the game RUNE. RUNE is a in-development solo Souls-like game that I'm working on, and right now it is in playtest mode where we are testing out some of the early combat rules for the game. I recorded 3 videos before this one that take you through the tutorial scenarios that if you are a playtester or interested in playtesting, you've probably already read these or gone through these tutorial scenarios. This video and some of the other videos I'm going to record are going to show you some of the more, I don't know, maybe advanced rules for RUNE, things that don't get represented in the tutorial scenarios, but are still an important part of how the game works. This video is focused on terrain and hazards, and so I want to talk about those two things in 2 different ways. So let's start by talking about terrain. RUNE takes place in a 4x4 grid, which is fine, but on its own, empty, it's kind of boring, right? And we saw in the early tutorial scenarios that, yeah, you're kind of just running around what feels like an open field. We don't always fight in open fields. Dungeons are full of strange rooms and things like that, which means we need different types of terrain. RUNE has 2 different types of terrain in it. There is sort of permanent terrain, and then there is difficult terrain. In this example here, we are the green knight character, that is the player character, and this red soldier is going to represent all the enemy characters in the examples I'm going to go through. Right now on the grid, I have 2 special types of terrain represented. This X through this space would be one way that I could represent a permanent piece of terrain. Permanent terrain is terrain that we can't move through. So if I wanted to move closer to this enemy, I wouldn't be able to move into this space. The permanent terrain blocks me from doing it. Think of this as like a wall or a giant stone pillar or anything else that you can't walk through. Maybe in a future update there will be things like being able to fly through or phase through walls, but right now you can't go through permanent terrain. The other important thing about permanent terrain is that it blocks line of sight. This is especially important for characters that have ranged abilities or long ranges on how they can attack people. I want to look at these top 2 cards to explain this concept. Let's say we're the player character, and we've got our sling with us. So we're trying to play a long distance game here. Well, the sling has a range of 2 spaces, which in theory, this enemy is 2 spaces away. I should be able to hit them. But this pillar here, or this wall, or whatever, is completely blocking my line of sight. Because I have no way of drawing a line between my square and this square without getting through this permanent terrain, there's no way that I can attack them. So I can't, curve the sling rock around the giant wall here. I'd have to move before I would be able to attack this character. I would have to be able to move something like maybe right here. And now I can draw a line between them and I can throw my rock or use my sling against this enemy at a range of 2. Similarly, the enemy is a caster that has a range of 2 or 3. They can go 1, 2. Again, they could hit me, but they can't because there's no line of sight. They would need to move over to the side where 1, 2, 3, they now can draw a line between me and the space that they are in to shoot their blast or their energy ray or whatever this caster has on them. That's how permanent terrain works. The other form of terrain is a difficult terrain. Difficult terrain doesn't block line of sight. You can fire your slings or your casts over it, but what it does is it inhibits movement. You can move onto and through this sort of difficult terrain, but it costs you extra movement. Instead of taking 1 move to move onto the space, moving into or through difficult terrain takes 2 values of movement here. So let's say, for example, I did roll a 3 or 4 on my sling. I've got 3 move on it. I would use 1, 2 to move into this space, and then the 3rd to be able to move into this space. If you don't have enough movement to move either into or through the permanent terrain, if you're already in it, you just don't get to move. You're stuck in the marsh or the debris or whatever it is that's slowing you down. So that's terrain that can be manifested onto the map, and you'll see if terrain is relevant in a combat scenario in RUNE because it'll be mapped out ahead of time. Now, it's not mapped out in any of the tutorial scenarios, but when you're in the sandbox mode and you're playing around with your own builds and different enemies, I highly recommend playing with this and throwing out different terrain and seeing how that feels. The other thing I wanted to talk about are hazards. Hazards is a catch-all term for traps, snares, other sorts of things that we intentionally leave on the ground that are going to try and mess with either us, the player, or the enemies. The player has access to putting down hazards. The enemies also have access to putting down these sorts of hazards. And there are a couple of different types of hazards. I've got 2 cards here in the bottom that I want you to take a look at when focusing on how we learn hazards. For example, if I was the player and I had the RUNE trap, the RUNE trap allows me to place snare hazards on the ground. I might represent the snare hazard with this green circle because I'm the green player. What I can do is I can place a snare hazard in any empty adjacent space. A snare hazard is a triggered hazard, meaning it's just going to sit there until somebody steps on it. Once they step on it, ideally this enemy right here, who I've now funneled here because of this permanent terrain, they're going to step on this, they're going to get snared, they don't get to take any actions, and I get the whole rest of the turn to try and destroy them while they're snared up. So that is an example of a triggered hazard. It's something that sits and stays until something happens. Usually somebody stepping on the space, though there may be different triggers for these different scenarios. The other sort of example are the timed hazards. These are hazards that last for a certain amount of time before they go away. An example of this is the Noxious hazard. The Noxious Shambler is a type of enemy that actually can't hurt you, the player, directly, but what they do is they move around and they leave noxious timed hazards in their wake. So they leave all these kind of gaseous, poisonous clouds behind them that if you walk through them, they're going to mess you up. Now, these noxious traps, they don't stay permanently on the board like the snares do, because these are timed triggers. They last for a certain number of rounds. And these time triggers are specified on the effects themselves. So if you were to read the rule book that has the listing for the noxious and all of this sort of stuff, you would see how long that particular trap lasts or that hazard lasts compared to other hazards that might have different timings on them. So now you have an understanding about how terrain works. There's the permanent terrain that you can't move through and blocks line of sight. There is the difficult terrain that slows down your movement. And then there are hazards, these sort of traps that we lay down that either sit there until they're triggered or they last a certain amount of time on the map. These two things dynamically change the way that the grid feels. At first, while it was just sort of a blank, boring 4x4, you can immediately start to see how terrain is going to change the way that you are able to move or the enemy's able to move. And these traps on top of it mean it's not just where you and the enemy are that matters. Now every other space is possibly a battleground as these snares and hazards and traps and all sorts of things are laid out. So this video hopefully gives you a better understanding about those two elements. If you are playtesting RUNE, I highly recommend throwing in some of this terrain, throwing in some of these hazards, see how it feels. If you're interested in playtesting and you haven't gotten access to the materials, the links for the RUNE website where you can find all the playtest materials are in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this video and all the other videos, and you have a better understanding of how to play RUNE. Bye!